Imagine walking into a church in Harlem and feeling the room go cold the instant a man opens a briefcase. The organ hums. Faces fold into prayer. Men who have settled disputes with their fists and their reputations now sit stiff and still. Frank Lucas closes the briefcase, takes the stacked bills in both hands, and lays them on the closed casket as if placing a crown. The gesture is, by design, simple, brutal, and impossible to ignore. A pile of cash in the center of a room full of men who measure power by what they can take and what they must now acknowledge. If you want the full story of how he did it, subscribe now. Bumpy Johnson, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, had been Harlem's unquestioned shadow authority for decades. A man who kept a fragile order by reputation and violence, whose name carried a kind of social credit through the neighborhood. When Bumpy died, the vacuum was not merely about territory, it was about the language of respect. Who would be allowed to speak for Harlem from then on? Frank Lucas was supposed to be a driver, a dependable hands-on lieutenant who had learned the city's rhythms behind the wheel. He had been Bumpy's driver, his aide, his trusted shadow. But when the mentor left the stage, the question was not just who would fill the role. Could anyone enforce the rules the way Bumpy had? Could anyone make rivals look away? The briefcase is the image everyone remembers. Reports say it held roughly $100,000 in cash. Accounts vary. Amounts reported differ. Verify. Frank's action that day at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, Verify, was neither quiet nor accidental. It was spectacle as strategy, an unambiguous public claim of stewardship. Money, in that moment, became a language. It said, I control resources, I can repay debts, I can command loyalty, or at least attention. It said, the rules in Harlem will be dictated from within, not bought from outside hands. Stories differ on the exact line Frank said as he straightened the bills against Bumpy's polished chest. Witness accounts, and journalists who later reconstructed the moment, offer only paraphrase, not verbatim quotes. The effect, however, is consistently documented. Silence, then a ripple of controlled astonishment. Men who had expected a funeral became an audience in an unscripted theater of power. Phones started to vibrate. Eyes darted to the exits. This was a public reading of a new balance. Not a direct threat to the mafia in Manhattan and Queens, but a very explicit demonstration that Frank Lucas intended to be the locus of influence in Harlem. Importantly, there is no verified photographic or eyewitness proof that the bosses representing 5 New York crime families physically knelt at that moment. Some later retellings of the story use the word kneel as a dramatic shorthand. The more defensible and verifiable claim is different. The gesture compelled a show of deference and opened a line of negotiation that changed how the Italian families viewed their dealings in Harlem. The spectacle forced a reassessment. It made rivals pause and ask how much it would cost to contest this man who had transformed a funeral into a declaration. The submission the title promises is better read as compelled deference, an obedience bought with clarity and menace rather than with rifles on the pavement. What Frank bought with that briefcase was time and a seat at a table other men assumed belonged to others. The currency he wielded, cash in an era before electronic funds and quick bank transfers, was immediate, persuasive, and untraceable. It solved short-term problems. It paid off grudges. It paid for the silence of people who otherwise might have pointed out inconvenient details. Beyond that tactical value, the act communicated a mindset. Visibility could be power if deployed correctly. The funeral was not the beginning of Frank's ascent. It was the public affront that accelerated it. For years prior, he had been a meticulous organizer, a man who watched and cataloged. Where others saw chaos, Frank began to see systems, routes, contacts, weak links. He learned how couriers timed their pickups. He learned which docks never asked questions at dawn. He observed the cost of rent-seeking, the way product moved through a chain of middlemen until profit had been carved into nothing but risk. If violence was one lever of control, the second was efficiency. Not long after the funeral, a call came through to the family home that made it clear the spectacle had been received. According to accounts, representatives from the Italian side, led by Carmine Tramunti, Verify, at the time a recognized figure among the 5 families, phoned. The message was terse and disciplined. Negotiate. What followed was a meeting at a modest restaurant, a neutral table where the air was thick with coffee and unspoken threat. The record of that evening is opaque in places. Details blurred by time and by the fact that men who sit across from each other in such negotiations are careful conversationalists, but the outcome is less disputed. For a limited term, a 6-month trial, according to multiple reconstructions, Frank would have space to operate without a direct war with the mafia. In exchange, there were concessions, arrangements and promises couched in the language of business, not war. That arrangement, this informal détente, mattered because it allowed Frank to build without immediate interruption. He became a shadow operator, not the face, but the brain. On the street, he preferred others to be seen. He needed a front. Enter Nicky Barnes, charismatic, sharp, a man with a knack for presentation who could be exposed to public view and absorb attention while the invisible cogs turned. Barnes became the public face, Frank, the architect behind the curtains. It was a clean division of labor. Publicity meant heat, anonymity meant safety. By placing Barnes at the center of Harlem's visible drug trade, Frank bought himself a manager's seat, the breathing room to design logistics, negotiate with suppliers, and structure revenue streams. Frank's dominant innovation was not theatricality, it was a supply chain calculus that read like a recipe for corporate dominance applied to an illicit market. Rather than pay the layers of margin that traditional distribution demanded, retailers paying wholesalers, wholesalers paying bosses further up the chain, he cut corners. He went to the source. He sought to eliminate as many intermediaries as possible, thereby claiming a larger slice of the value that otherwise drained away across continents. The centerpiece of that strategy was the Golden Triangle, the opium-rich highlands of Southeast Asia, where a large portion of the world's heroin was produced in the mid-20th century. Trips to that region were, by necessity, irregular, expensive and dangerous, but they offered scale. If you could procure product directly in purity and then control the route to market, you could set prices, enforce loyalty with money and muscle, and build a cash flow that underwrote nearly anything. Frank's described method was less about brute force and more about removal of friction, eliminate middlemen, minimize checks, shorten the route from factory to street. Accounts, court documents, and later interviews reconstruct a pattern. Purchasing raw product abroad, securing transport with the help of suppliers and intermediaries, some Corsican, some from regional networks, and moving product across borders in ways that maximized concealment while minimizing the number of hands that touched the cargo. Among the stranger, but widely reported, details of his logistics are the stories about shipments moved with a cloak of respectability. Case histories that reached investigators and journalists included claims that caskets were sometimes used to move goods into the country. Reports vary and many specifics remain contested. Verify. Such accounts circulate for two reasons. They are rhetorically sharp. Hiding contraband in a coffin resonates like a parable, and they signify the lengths to which smugglers and complicit actors will go to exploit trust. Whether every version of that story is perfectly accurate matters less than the larger truth it points to. Frank was willing to use imaginative and morally corrosive methods to keep product flowing where customers waited. The product itself changed the equation. Reports from the period refer to a branded high-purity product, later known in press accounts as Blue Magic, reportedly a marketing term attached to Frank's operation that differed from the lower-grade substances circulating in many neighborhoods. In markets awash with inconsistent purity, a high-quality product meant customers could, or were persuaded to, prefer one supplier over another, and users seeking a predictable effect would pay premiums. That consistency translated into price control. It also made addiction an even more predictable, business-like forecast. The systemic harm, communities flooded with a drug that worked predictably and, therefore, could hook people more effectively, should not be sidelined in any account of Frank's ascent. Strategy and entrepreneurship do not neutralize consequences. The very efficiency that made Frank's enterprise prosperous also intensified the public health toll on Harlem and the cities he touched. Money flowed, and with money came the tools of expansion. Rents to front men, payoffs to mid-level enforcers, bribes to those who looked the other way. Frank's model relied on a lattice of plausible deniability. The man on the corner could point to Barnes as the visible head. The cash business allowed quick settlements. But it also required a tight internal discipline. Trust among lieutenants, ruthlessness toward betrayal, and a managerial capacity that read suspiciously like corporate oversight. Frank kept ledgers in his head. He understood measurement. Where others lit the fuse and watched chaos bloom, he tried to manage supply, demand, and distribution channels like parts of a machine. That machine had structural advantages. Eliminating layers of payment reduced the leakage that had previously enriched outside wholesalers and the lower-level affiliates of the mafia. It made Frank's operation unusually profitable, at least until its visibility attracted attention. Even modest cuts in the number of intermediaries multiplied returns exponentially in cash terms. But the model also concentrated risk. If the supply line was exposed, the fall would be swift because so many mechanisms were centralized under a few decision-makers. The period between Bumpy's funeral and the time when Frank's name hunted headlines was not a single flash of success. It was a concatenation of moves, strategic generosity followed by quiet deals, the selection of a front man in Barnes, the cultivation of suppliers in Southeast Asia and Northern Europe, and a disciplined pattern of reinvesting cash into protection. Neighborhood establishments that once hosted community meetings now had to make small calculations, accepting money, not asking questions, or losing out. Families whose members were trapped in addiction were collateral damage to a business model whose profit depended on steady demand. While Frank took steps to hide his direct connection to the street-level trade, the operation's financial scale could not stay secret forever. Enormous sums of unreported cash have a way of leaving traces. Flashy purchases, sudden shifts in spending, new real estate holdings, conspicuous philanthropy aimed at softening reputations. Frank's caution, however, slowed the leak. He kept the most incriminating activities at arm's length, routed transactions through trusted intermediaries, and, when necessary, bought the silence of those whose professions could have exposed him. Law enforcement would later describe a web of corrupt officers and informants who, for a price, allowed the system to hum. Those corrupt connections were not instantaneous. They were the product of time, opportunity, and reciprocity. During the early years of expansion, rival families watching from the sidelines had a choice: attempt to crush an upstart before it consolidated, or negotiate a truce that required less immediate violence. The funeral's publicness had already made a sort of negotiation inevitable. For the Italian families that controlled the city's most entrenched rackets, a full-scale confrontation promised disruption, police attention, and a loss of profit on their other enterprises. Pragmatism, more often than valor, drove decisions in that era. The result was a wary coexistence stitched together by clandestine payments and quiet agreements. From the vantage of the street, the consequences of this new order were immediate. The quality of product became a competitive advantage that customers noticed. Prices stabilized at higher margins. The money that flowed into Harlem under Frank's system financed not only payoffs, but also ostentation: houses, cars, clothes. Ostentation, as Frank himself would learn, is a double-edged sword. It consolidates reputation among peers. It also paints a target on your back. In the months that followed the funeral, Frank's appetite for control showed an economist's neatness and a gambler's appetite for risk. He scaled carefully, measured loyalty, and rewarded efficiency. He also, in the shadows, built a contingency plan for when the system failed. Those contingencies involved placing trust in men who could be counted on to take a bullet, to disappear, or to lie if necessary. That reality sits uneasily with any narrative that romanticizes Frank as merely a brilliant entrepreneur. He engineered not only supply lines and ledgers, but also a pragmatic system for softening the consequences of betrayal. The numbers tell part of the story. The increase in cash flow was dramatic by local standards. Profits allowed him to expand the operation's footprint beyond Harlem into other boroughs, and even into New Jersey. At the same time, these profits enabled investments in people, frontmen, negotiators, paymasters, who could stand before a judge or a reporter and claim ignorance, or claim they were simply business people caught in a market that the city had already been flooded by other actors. The moral calculus remained ugly. Wealth created by a business that preyed on addiction, on the steady attrition of human lives, buys influence both in the underworld and the institutions that police, or fail to police, those neighborhoods. There is a quietness to the way Frank ran things that reads almost clinical. Avoid the spotlight, control the flow, use spectacle when necessary to send a message. The funeral's briefcase was spectacle at its purest. Nicky Barnes was spectacle as a diversion. The supplier contacts were the practical substrate. This threefold system, symbol, face, and supply chain, sustained a period of unusual dominance that scholars and journalists later described as both brilliant and destructive. Yet dominance breeds contradictions. As the operation escalated, patterns emerged that were easier for determined investigators to follow. A brand-name drug finds a customer base pays cash. Cash flows into particular neighborhoods and stores. Those stores change hands, pay higher rents, or remodel. Conspicuous purchases accumulate. For all the care taken to mask origins, material accumulation leaves a trail. Frank's careful management slowed the trail, but it could not erase the fact that entire communities were changing under the pressure of new money and new dependencies. Families fractured. In the places that his product reached most densely, public health worsened, emergency rooms saw surges, and local leaders began to point the finger at an industry of dealers and their invisible managers. By the time Frank's supply lines were humming, by the time Blue Magic began to circulate widely, and customers recognized its reliability, the operation had reached a scale that few in Harlem had seen. The men who once would have taken offense at a briefcase on a casket were now making smaller calculations about how to coexist with a de facto ruler. Businessmen with ties to other operations made private deals. Politicians accepted contributions. Local shopkeepers accepted payments to keep quiet about late-night deliveries. The city's web of complicity, both institutional and personal, deepened. And yet, in the calculus of risk and spectacle, a fundamental tension remained. The more Frank wanted to be safe, the more money he had to spend on appearing normal. The more he tried to be invisible, the more difficult it became to keep others from seeing. This paradox would define the next phase of his story. The same boldness that allowed his briefcase stunt to work would, in time, create openings for those who looked for patterns. The very displays that consolidated respect could, if used carelessly, become hooks for law enforcement. As winter turned into spring and the operation filled out its networks, the city adjusted. Dealers who had once worked for half the price were now offered contracts. Middlemen who did not adapt were replaced. The architecture of the trade hardened into something that resembled corporate governance more than street rumor. Payrolls, meeting schedules, and routes, once improvised, grew disciplined. This organizational shift made the enterprise more profitable, but it also made it, in certain respects, more legible. Legibility attracts attention. Detectives who had historically chased street-level dealers increasingly found a pattern that suggested someone more central was running things. One such investigator, who would later become a central figure in the effort to dismantle the operation, began to notice the unusual flows. Sudden spikes in spending tied to particular neighborhoods, an increase in body counts where competitors had resisted, and a pattern of loyalty enforced not by random terror, but by calculated reward. But those investigations, and the dramatic public moments that would later define Frank's fall, had not yet arrived. For now, in this first arc, a man who began as a driver had turned a funeral into a public claim, and built with terrifying efficiency a system that funneled foreign product into American neighborhoods. The moral ledger was already registering entries, extraordinary ingenuity on one side, extraordinary harm on the other. Frank had purchased not only deference, but also an unprecedented responsibility for the consequences of his own designs. The silence in that Harlem church would echo in the weeks to come. Men who had brushed against violence and had survived it looked at one another and, in private, recalculated their options. The Italian families who oversaw much of the city's rackets could have chosen war and disruption. Instead, a pragmatic detente allowed Frank a window. He used it to entrench. He used it to build a supply chain that would change street economics. He used it to create a visible face in Nicky Barnes, who could be photographed, courted, and blamed when necessary. The beginning of Frank Lucas's transformation from driver to architect thus closed on a small chilling negotiation. Respect, reframed as a business term, paid in cold currency, and accepted at a table with coffee and hushed voices. Weeks turned into months. Routes were refined, payments smoothed. Harlem's corners began to settle into a new rhythm, and somewhere in that period of consolidation, as the enterprise matured, the seeds of later hubris and the visibility that would undo him were being planted. The very tools that had made him untouchable, efficiency, spectacle, a branded product, would, in time, be the instruments of his exposure. For now, though, he had what he wanted: power, profit, and a measure of control over the narrative of his own rise. The rest of the city would take notice, and history would record both the ingenuity and the devastation with equal care. Visibility is a dangerous currency. For 5 years, Frank Lucas had spent it sparingly, saving his public moments for maximum effect. Then, in an arena built for spectacle, the boxing ring, he made a choice that would widen the aperture of public attention until it found him. At a high-profile fight in New York, reports point to the Ailey Frazier era, though exact dates and details verify, someone wearing opulence beyond Harlem's usual air walked through the crowd. In an audience of reporters, celebrities, and men accustomed to reading status, a chinchilla coat cost as much as a small house in the neighborhood. The coat mattered less for its warmth than for what it broadcast: money unhidden, pride unmeasured, a signal that the man beneath it had nothing to fear from scrutiny. It was ostentation so loud it made protective silence impossible. If the funeral briefcase had been a whispered command, the coat was a roar. Detectives don't follow coattails, they follow patterns. But patterns need an initial hook. For some investigators, a flash of luxury in a place full of questions sufficed. Richie Roberts, then a dedicated officer who would later be known for his role in taking down layers of corruption, noticed anomalies, sudden spending spikes, new properties tied, indirectly, to people around Harlem, and a network of front men whose lifestyles no longer matched their declared incomes. The chinchilla was a name on a list, an item in a ledger that needed an explanation. It showed up in reports. It became one of the threads that detectives tugged, not because the fur was criminal, but because the fur was evidence of a system that had become extractive and visible enough to trace. Visibility is a paradox for an operator who had built his entire strategy around reducing intermediaries. The more efficient Frank made the trade, the more concentrated the flows of money and influence became. That concentration left a map. As investigators traced business filings, monitored phone taps, some authorized, some excess, and interviewed turncoats, a broader portrait emerged. This was not simply a street operation with a charismatic figure at the front. It was a vertically integrated enterprise, with the rare combination of a branded product, disciplined logistics, and money flowing into predictable places. What followed was the gradual sharpening of the investigative lens. Local detectives, federal agents, and prosecutors began to connect the dots. The cloth of a coat could be bought in the same way that a casket might be bought, through sources with shadowy loyalties. A branded product circulating in one neighborhood often matched purchasing spikes elsewhere, and sudden affluence among associates suggested a funnel of cash that fed upward. These were the ingredients of federal interest, and federal agents have tools that city detectives often lack. Cooperation began across agencies. Subpoenas were issued, surveillance intensified. The legal crescendo came in 1975 when coordinated raids punctured the carefully maintained apparatus. Homes, offices, safe houses, once thought insulated by layers of deniability, were searched. Records were seized, cash counted, and men arrested. The headlines that followed did not just stammer about a kingpin brought low. They detailed a network that implicated law enforcement, intermediaries, and foreign suppliers. The raids were a turning point because they moved the story from rumor to court document, from whispered accounts to an evidentiary trail. Frank Lucas's arrest was not a sudden cinematic takedown by a single squad in a hail of shouting. It was a legal inevitability constructed from accumulation, ledgers, witness statements, and the cooperative work of agents who had followed financial signals until they met concrete evidence. Once in custody, Lucas faced decisions shaped by a simple human calculus: protect the enterprise at the cost of his freedom, or trade knowledge for leniency. He chose the second path. Cooperation is an ambiguous moral instrument. It dismantles corruption and holds people accountable. It also rewards self-preservation and can fracture the code of silence that sustains criminal organizations. In Frank's case, his decision to cooperate, providing testimony and names to investigators, did bring down a swath of corrupt officers and disrupted the relationships that had allowed the trade to function with relative impunity. Men who took payoffs and looked the other way at checkpoints were exposed. Middlemen with convenient amnesia were named. Those consequences mattered for the civic order. They mattered for victims who had sought accountability. They also came at a personal cost to Frank, who traded control for a reduced sentence and a degree of safety that could never fully erase the moral toll of what his enterprise had wrought. Court documents and contemporaneous reporting detail some of the outcomes: convictions of certain corrupt officers, prosecutions of associates, and a general disruption of the networks that once funneled product into city neighborhoods. The legal victory for investigators was partial and complicated. Cooperation did not undo the damage to communities already harmed. It did not bring back lives lost to addiction or reverse the erosion of neighborhoods. The justice that followed was procedural, not restorative. Lewd reality: a few high-profile convictions do not stitch up the social fabric that organized dependency has frayed. Nicky Barnes, the public figure who had absorbed attention as Frank's visible emissary, fared in predictable yet tragic ways. His visibility made him a target. He became entangled in his own legal struggles, and like others who occupied the spotlight, he paid a steep price. This was part of Frank's managerial calculus. Visibility could be leveraged, but it could not be infinitely controlled. Men placed before cameras often find cameras turning on them in courtrooms. While federal cases unfolded, another story was playing out in the neighborhoods that had borne the brunt of the trade. Emergency rooms saw more overdoses. Local economies distorted. Small businesses faced new competitors who paid higher rents backed by illicit cash. Families experienced the slow, grinding attrition of addiction among relatives. Community leaders and clergy, those who had watched Frank place that briefcase on a casket, found their earlier calculations now measured against daily human cost. The moral ledger that observers kept became heavier and harder to reconcile. A man who could read systems had used that skill in a way that created prosperity for some and devastation for many. When the trial and testimony cycles concluded, sentencing reflected the ambiguous role of cooperation. Frank received a reduced sentence relative to the scale of the enterprise he had described. His cooperation had value in dismantling corruption that reached into civic institutions. Critics argued that the bargain favored the wealthy and the clever at the expense of victims who saw little in the way of recompense. Defenders highlighted the convictions of corrupt officers and the disruption of networks that might otherwise have continued unchecked. Both positions contain elements of truth. After release from custody, Frank's life did not return him to the throne that briefcase had catapulted him toward. He lived with the consequences of notoriety, sometimes pitied, sometimes reviled, sometimes remembered with a grudging respect for his tactical mind. He tried in various accounts to reintegrate, to mend family relationships, to find work that would tether him to legal rhythms. Yet the market he had once commanded did not simply pause and forgive. The damage endured. The people who had lost much did not regain what was taken. Legacy is an unruly thing. For historians and journalists, Frank Lucas offers a compact lesson in contradiction. On one axis, he appears as a strategist who applied a business logic, vertical integration, brand management, cost-cutting, to an illicit market with the efficiency of a sober-minded executive. On another axis, he is a figure who engineered and profited from the distribution of a drug that fueled addiction and chipped away at the civic life of neighborhoods. Admiration for his acumen is tempered and often eclipsed by appraisal of harm. This is the central moral ambivalence that the story forces on any observer. Can one separate operational brilliance from the value of the ends it served? Should ingenuity divorced from ethical restraint be celebrated as genius or condemned as sociopathy? The title of this piece claims that Frank forced 5 mob families to kneel at Bumpy Johnson's funeral. That is a rhetorically powerful image. As addressed earlier, it deserves nuance. There is no verified photographic or contemporaneous eyewitness evidence that leaders of the 5 New York families literally dropped to their knees in that church. The language of kneeling works as metaphor, an image of compelled deference, and it captures an essential truth about the consequences of Frank's act. It triggered a strategic reassessment among rival powers and opened a path to negotiation rather than immediate bloodshed. The documentation supports a claim of compelled deference and a recalibration of relationships, not a literal filmed moment of supplication. This distinction matters because it separates myth from documented consequence. The briefcase bought time and bargaining power. It did not necessarily buy theatrical submission. What, then, is the disturbing message woven through these events? It is not simply that audacity can win obedience. It is that the same tools that allow a person to consolidate power, efficiency, spectacle, a willingness to exploit institutional blind spots, can create harm on a scale that outstrips any personal benefit. Frank's story reveals a modern alchemy, turning global supply chains into local profit, then turning profit into social influence. The conversion works until it doesn't. Visibility that yields authority can, through a single reckless flourish, transform into vulnerability. Cooperation that saves a life sentence cannot restore communities. The calculus of power, when divorced from concern for human cost, yields a ledger in which the bottom line is often tragedy. There is another discomforting lesson. Institutions tasked with protecting the public can be compromised by the same flows of money that enrich criminal networks. Corruption enabled Frank's business to function. Its exposure cleaned up some actors, but it also revealed systemic fragility. That fragility is not unique to any one era. Markets will always find leakage. Where there is profit and human desire, systems will adapt, sometimes lawfully, often not. The Frank Lucas saga, therefore, is both a cautionary tale about individual hubris and a sobering study of institutional vulnerability. In the final accounting, how should we remember Frank Lucas? As a tactical genius who bent systems to his will? As a man who exploited human frailty for gain? The answer is both. History rarely offers clean villains or pure heroes. Instead, it presents figures like Frank who are remarkable in certain capacities and ruinous in their effects. Remembering him requires holding two truths: the admiration for an engineer of organization and the condemnation for what that organization delivered into the lives of ordinary men and women. There are small human epilogues that underline this complexity. Ava, his wife, reported, in interviews chronicled later, the strain that secrecy and risk placed on family life. Verify. Associates who testified against him often described conflicting loyalties: gratitude for opportunity, shame for consequences, and fear for the future. Neighborhood pastors and community organizers spoke of the long tail of pain that followed the rise and fall, noting that legal actions, while necessary, did not substitute for meaningful investment in recovery and prevention. If there is a final irony in Frank's arc, it is this: he sought to make crime efficient, predictable, and managerial, as if the illicit were merely a sector to be optimized. In doing so, he introduced predictability into an otherwise chaotic underworld. Predictability draws attention. Attention draws consequences. The life of a system builder is a life of exposure to collapse. A single flashy coat can become the first step toward unraveling an empire. We end where the story once began, with a briefcase, a casket, and men in a church deciding what respect meant in a world remade by commerce. That moment was not a fairy tale of total submission. It was a calculated claim to authority that, for a time, reshaped the rules. The subsequent chapters, supply lines, brand-name drugs, conspicuous consumption, investigation, and cooperation, compose a narrative that asks a blunt question about power. At what point does the ability to command turn into a responsibility to repair? Frank Lucas did not answer that question in ways that satisfied everyone. He bought deference with cash and negotiated safety with silence. He traded knowledge to reduce punishment and lived with history's ambivalence. The disturbing message implied by his rise and fall is simple and grim. Systems designed solely for profit, without moral accounting, will magnify harm even as they create wealth. Spectacle can force obedience, but it cannot absolve consequence. The briefcase bought him a throne of sorts. The choices that accompanied that throne bought suffering for many and a complicated legacy for him. If this shocked you, hit like and tell us in the comments. Was Frank Lucas a brilliant strategist or a warning about the seduction of power? If you want to explore more untold stories from crime history, subscribe and watch our next deep dive.